Good morning, DJ and PK. It's 97.5 The Zone. Welcome in on a Tuesday morning. A game day for the Minnesota Timberwolves, possibly, / probably, their last game of the year. Maybe they pull it off. Maybe they can win it, force a game 5, get back to Minnesota. But Dallas has been so impressive. My gosh. Kyrie Irving, no distractions, no nonsense. He's playing at a very high level. Luka Doncic playing at an even higher level. When the series started, I was talking about how those two both had to be on. In any game, the Mavericks were going to win. I mean, that's their recipe. And they've been on. They've been on every game. And most importantly, they have been on at the end of every game. These guys, one or the other or both, have hit big shots in the last 3 or 4 minutes of games. And Minnesota has done a great job of hanging in there. Every game's been competitive. And in game 1, the last 3 minutes, Dallas took over, finished on a 10-3 run, and won the game. Game 2, obviously, they won the last 30 seconds. They got a stop. They got the ball. They hit a 3. 3 seconds left. They get another stop. They win the game. And then in this most recent game, game 3 on Sunday, that game was tied going to the fourth quarter. It was tied at 100. It was tied at 102. It was tied at 104. And then they just take over and win the game. It's just as simple as that. Dallas took over. Kyrie Irving, Luka Doncic making plays. Buckets, passes, whatever it took. They got it done again. And again, they finished on a run, completely dominated Minnesota. In the last 4 minutes, Minnesota only got 3 points. And that's just not going to get it done. So Minnesota's down 3-0, and they are on the verge of doing, well, exactly what we saw over in the East, because Boston finishes off. They sweep the series. They beat Indiana. And, of course, Indiana, number one, I don't think any of us really thought Indiana was going to do it. I didn't hear anybody picking Indiana. And then Indiana, has an injury to, their guy in the series. And so they go from, we're probably not doing this to we're getting swept. So I assume it's going to be Boston and Dallas. And the way Dallas is playing, it's a little hard to believe that it won't be Dallas right now. And I've been thinking it's Boston's time, and this is their 6th time in 8 years they've been in the conference finals. Now that they swept the series, win another close game in Indiana. Indiana hadn't lost a playoff game in the first 2 rounds. They were 6-0, but they lose twice to the Celtics. The Celtics are the best in the East. They showed it. They had the best record in the entire league in the regular season, and they've gone through the postseason here. They are now 12-2 in the playoffs. So Boston, as expected, showing up in the NBA Finals. And I assume Dallas will be there shortly, but we'll let that play out. The other big story of the weekend, which was surprising when I saw it, and the more I think about it, the more I think, well, maybe it's not that surprising. And that is a story that the ACC, Utah to the ACC, if the ACC needs replacement teams. Now, how many replacement teams do they need? How much is ESPN willing to pay? Is the ACC, how big a share is Utah? Are they coming in at full share, half share, 3/4 share? Now we're getting to the point where everything's negotiated. It used to be everybody came in at a full share, but that's just not the way things go as you watch the Pac-12 break up. Oregon and Washington went in for a half share. UCLA went into the Big Ten for a full share, but they got to give money to Cal for 3 years. Stanford, Cal, and SMU all bit the bullet going into the ACC. But I think it comes down to how much leverage do you have. And the stories that are out there are by, longtime reputable reporters, so I assume they've heard something. And I assume they've heard what they've told us. And Fletcher was saying that it's Utah, San Diego State, Oregon State, and USF. Now, maybe the only surprise in there is that it's USF and not UCF. Why not Washington State? Maybe that's a little bit of a surprise as well. But, I can see ESPN trying to keep the ACC alive, even a damaged ACC, because they're making money off the ACC network. I have said many times, and I really believe this, I really don't think there is anything that the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the ACC can do to keep the SEC and the Big Ten from raiding them, because they just have too much money. They've got schools in the parts of the country that have the most people. They've got a ton of passion. The ACC is in a lot of pro markets. The Pac-12 was in a lot of pro markets. The Big 12 is in a lot of markets that don't have a lot of people. They're all at a disadvantage compared to the SEC and compared to the Big 10. So the Big 12 didn't start a network. The Pac-12 started their own network. The ACC started a network with ESPN. They all did it different ways, and it doesn't matter. Oklahoma and Texas get rated. USC and UCLA get rated, and now Florida State looks like they're out, and Clemson and/or North Carolina to follow. And if there's three, there'll be a fourth. I can't imagine they're going to go with three. So we'll see if it's two or if it's four. I would assume that's the way it works out. Maybe not immediately, but I assume that's the way it works out. And so, but the one thing I do think after you get rated, the ACC is in a better place because ESPN is going to want to keep that network alive. They're making money off the ACC network. Now, who can they get? Who's willing to come? That's where it gets interesting. Would Utah listen? Of course. I think everybody should listen. I think everybody should be talking all the time. I think even if it's unlikely, even if it's very unlikely, you should go ahead and talk. It's too crazy right now. There's too many wild things happening. Build relationships. Build a relationship based on it's not a great fit right now. Let's say, just for argument's sake, Tom Homo doesn't think the ACC is a good fit, and the ACC doesn't think BYU is a good fit. They should be talking anyway, because just because they're not a good fit now doesn't mean it won't be a good fit in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years. It's too crazy out there. I mean, half of the Big 12 has been rated. They lost Texas A&M. They lost Missouri. They lost Nebraska. They lost Colorado. Now they've lost Oklahoma and Texas. That's 6 of the original 12 gone. And the only thing crazier than that is Colorado came back. So if you think you know what's going to happen, great. But you don't know. You think you know. You think you know what option A is, and you even know what the backup plan is, but it's just too crazy now. Everybody ought to be talking all the time. Should Utah go? Tell me what the money is, and then I'll answer that question. Tell me what the money is. Will the Big 12 end up raiding the ACC? Maybe. Will the ACC end up raiding the Big 12? Maybe. Will they come to some meeting of the minds? Now, I know a lot of us would say, hey, they ought to divvy these schools up regionally. Okay, that makes sense, holding down travel costs. But the more new markets the ACC gets into, the more money ESPN can pull out of cable and satellite bills. Because you get more. You may have the ACC on your Comcast right now or on your DirecTV right now. I don't think Dish has it. And then they get, I don't know what they get, 10 or 20 cents or 30 cents or whatever it is. Yeah, but if you're in the footprint, let's say if you're in Utah and Utah goes into the league, well, then they're probably getting 60, 70, 80, 90 cents or $1 out of your cable bill. They get more money. So do I think that the ACC is going to want to be redundant going into markets? No, because ESPN is going to tell them you're worth more money if you get into new markets. Now, all of a sudden, getting into Oregon, it's basically got twice as many people as Utah. Getting the youth, we understand why that makes sense. Getting into Southern California, getting into San Diego, basically San Diego County has as many people as the state of Utah. I think Utah actually has a couple 100,000 more, maybe 3.4 million, and San Diego's somewhere between 3 and 3.2. But you get why they're thinking that. I absolutely. So I guess the only surprise is why isn't UCF interested? Because I would think the ACC would rather have UCF over USF. So, but Utah is the only one of the four that's in the Big 12. And the other three, I mean, they're all in G5. Now, maybe they're coming, for a half share or a quarter share. Who knows? Who knows? It's all really preliminary. We have to wait and see who gets out of the ACC and how many teams they need. But it does make sense adding 3 teams out here to go with SMU, Stanford, and Cal and having a 6-team Western wing and minimizing a lot of that travel. It makes complete and total sense. So we'll see where that goes. That was interesting news over the weekend. We'll talk about it more later in the show, I'm sure. Right now, we are going to take a break. And when we come back, David Locke talking playoffs and talking Utah Jazz. We will do that next. DJ and PK, proudly presented by Murdoch Chevrolet, serving Utah since 1926. Good morning, DJ and PK, brought to you in part by America First Credit Union. Get the official debit cards of the Utah Jazz, University of Utah Sports, Real Salt Lake, and more exclusively at America First Credit Union. David Locke joined us on Friday. We talked playoffs. Obviously, the playoffs, it's not a surprise how they've gone, but the playoffs have progressed since then. So when David talks, at that point, Boston hadn't won their series and Dallas wasn't up 3-0 yet. But David Locke, here he is, talking playoffs and Jazz rebuild with PK and I.
But now we're back to basketball, with things going on here. General assessment of the playoffs is what I view is that it's the blessing and the curse of the NBA, because the regular season can be monotonous, but the playoffs are usually just so awesome, and I think this year has lived up to it again.
Yeah, it was a great note that was Dunked On, Nate Duncan's podcast, Dunked On. The Minnesota-Dallas game the other day was never outside of single digits. It was the first time that's happened in 4 years, or 3 years in a conference final or an NBA final game. That first Minnesota-Dallas game, nobody ever led by double digits in the entire game, which is unusual, actually, because we've had such runs with three-point shooting now that you can get up by 12 or 14. It doesn't really mean anything.
Right.
So just to have that tight a game. No, I think the playoffs have been great. I think the league has been on a quest for parity, and it's debatable whether it's actually good for the league, but they have been on the quest for this for some time, and they'll have their 6 different champion. The MVP won't have been to the finals for, I think, something like 10 straight years. Rudy's one of the only of the top 18 highest paid players that's still available, that's still playing right now. There's some incredible trends going on in the league right now for what they're trying to build and try to create. The 3 teams that kind of went all in with stars and no bench. None of them got out of the. None of them got out of the second round. Denver got to the second round, but Phoenix and Milwaukee lost in the first. So it's really interesting in what roster building and team building of what the NBA has created here. And I think Indiana's the most interesting case of all. They're the best mirror for us of what we can see out of a franchise. And what they've done has to be really encouraging for Jazz fans. They rebuild for about the trade to get Tyrese Halliburton, and Halliburton became a top right now.
I agree with what you said about parity. The NBA chased it, and they are achieving / have achieved it. They continue to achieve it. But they've also chased trying to get guys to play in more games and not sit out so many games. And they've worked at that. But I think that everything that's happened in the playoffs is just going to tell players, agents, and certainly coaches and executives, rest our guys during the regular season, because there have been so many injuries in this playoff. Halliburton, apparently hamstring injury earlier. Now his coach says it's the same hamstring. He's limping off in the third quarter. You could argue the series is over anyway, but if he's out, then the series is definitely over. Boston to the NBA Finals as expected. And in the Western Final, there's some doubt. But before I get too fired up, tell me if Conley's going to play, because when he was out in the last series, the team looked terrible. And tell me if Doncic is going to look like Doncic or if he's going to look like he's hurt, because the games he's limping around, Dallas hasn't looked very good. So I just think all these injuries, we're going to have guys playing 60 games against next year. Do you think the same thing?
Well, so one is injuries are up 20% in the playoffs. Injury games lost in the playoffs are up 20% from a year or two ago. So that's is that causation or correlation? That's the real question. I think we'd have to dig in and see whether the injuries are happening to players that would have been rested otherwise. I think there aren't that many players that actually fell under the NBA's new rules, right? You had to be an all-star star player to be one. I don't think Tyrese Halliburton probably even fell under the NBA rules. Maybe he did, but on some of the resting rules, and then the other part was whether you're eligible for awards, and we'd have to look and see, did Tyrese Halliburton play maybe the answer on this is yes, the last 15 games of the season, just so he'd be eligible to be All-NBA so he can make his extra $41 million. I think the answer to that's yes. And so then you do get into a question of, did that wear and tear coupled with the burden of NBA playoff games lead to a re-injury of his hamstring? I don't know the answer. It's awfully hard to come up with it, but it's a real issue, and it's the injuries in this playoffs are up, way, way up. I also just think we're playing the game. Everyone it's physical and it's softer and all this, but that's actually not what causes the injuries. Okay, so that is true. We're softer. You can't bury someone when they go to the basket anymore. But what causes the injuries is the starting and stopping and the, stutter steps and the changing in directions. If you watch a game, a 2023 NBA, 2024 NBA game, the amount of distance somebody's covering defensively is than it was 20, 25 years ago. Plus, we're up about 12 possessions a game on each side. So the burden is dramatically much bigger than it ever was back in the 90s or 2000s. While the game may be less physical, the things that cause injuries, which are starting, stopping, sprinting, covering ground, because of the space and the pace that we're playing with, the game just yields to so many more injuries than it ever did before.
Your reaction to the Jazz, I guess you could say they dropped 2 spots from 8th to 10th in the lottery.
On the surface, it sucks. However, I do think in a draft that is being, poo-pooed, and maybe rightfully so, you may not have a dramatic difference between what you get at 7, 8, 9, or 10, and then you're not paying as much for that player, which might be important. What would be bad would be to go get the 4th pick and then get a player that's the equivalent of the 16th and be paying them the set salary by the NBA rules that you get in the draft. So that it might not be the worst thing. And then, frankly, time will tell. But my guess is if there's a player at 6 or 7 that the Jazz really want, I think they could get there. They really have someone they believe in. I don't know that I've seen anyone yet that I think is somebody you'd really believe in like that. But if there is someone they really believe in, I think they could probably go get him. My understanding of last year's draft is that had the Jazz really had someone after 5 or 5 or below that they really wanted, they probably could have gone and got him. And so I think, it's not great to slide to 10 because it's easier to go move up if you're coming from 8 than from 10. But maybe not. Maybe if someone's got cap reasons, they'd rather have the 10th pick than the 8th pick. There's some reasons why when the Jazz are suddenly trading, that 31st pick might be more valuable than the 28th pick or whatever they have, 29 and 31 or whatever those two. The second-round pick that's not a set salary or, on that system is actually a better pick for cap purposes.
We will watch a bunch of highlights and a bunch of tape, and obviously scouts go to a bunch of games, and you got to do that. It's not that that's not the important part of the draft process, but watching Bob Myers, I think the other night he was talking, I think it was Halliburton he was talking about how the Warriors should have drafted him and they passed on him, and that was a mistake. You can know a lot about basketball, but drafting, isn't it more about the conversations and the people around them and know who's going to improve? Because they're drafting people so young, and the guys have to get better, and their bodies are going to change. So is the conversation mindset trying to figure out, as Jerry Sloan used to say when he tapped his chest, what's in here? Is that the part of the draft that everyone's struggling to figure out and why we're seeing these really good players go 15 or 27 or in the second round?
Maybe. I think the first thing is you've got to, there's teachable and non-teachable skills, right? So, and some of those are playing hard, right? I think, Gordy Chiesa always talks about play hard as a skill. I don't think you can teach play hard. So I do think that, that might be saying the same thing. But, 6'7", 210 is not coachable. I think what's so interesting about this draft, there's plenty of really good players, and I run the numbers on all these players. For all the talk about how bad this draft is, frankly, there's just as many players that, from a number standpoint, that look good and look bad as any other draft over the last 6 years that I've run my numbers off. It doesn't look worse. What looks worse is Reed, Sche, Shepard, who has maybe the best numbers of any player I've ever run, is 6'2", and needs to be 6'5". Like, if he's 6'5", he's Ray Allen. And you're drafting, or Bradley Beal, and you're like, he's going to be great. But he's 6'2". And Rob Dillingham is really interesting, but he's like 6'1" and 170 soaking wet. And Isaiah Collier has some interesting things, particularly if he was 6'6", but he's not. He's 6'3". So, like, in this draft particularly, the things that aren't teachable are what's lacking on a lot of players, which I think is going to make this particularly interesting to see how it plays out over time. I just think it's a little bit of a crapshoot, except for the fact that when you don't isolate a given draft, DJ, and you go look at 10 or 20 years of work, it's not a crapshoot. Like, it's a crapshoot after 11. And 50% of all players, and basically from 11 on through 30, there's about if you take 5-pick increments, there's about an equal chance of you getting a good player at any of those points. But the top 5 are the best players. And then the next 5 are the best players after that. And then it starts to equal out a little bit. So it's not as much of a crapshoot as we try to make it sound.
What percentage would you put on the Jazz using all 3 picks and bringing those 3 guys to camp?
I hope 0. I mean, you just can't have a roster that has 8 players that are in their second year or less, but maybe you can, right? You can. But I would hope 0. I would hope that we're able to parlay some of those assets into future assets or into some other pieces of puzzles that are not just draft picks.
Okay, so you'd be okay as far as not necessarily literally getting players that can be on the club next season?
Yeah, I would be totally. I mean, you have 3 players who all showed signs of development. You've already traded Ochai because you either decided his development wasn't going to happen or that Bryce Sensabaugh was better, right? There's only so many minutes players can get, so you actually at some point have to open paths for them to get there. If you go draft, and Walker needs time, I think Walker's year was better than people give him credit for. So I'm still a Walker believer. I think you go add 3 young players, and suddenly 7 of your rotation players are in their second year or less, right?
Yep.
That's a lot if you're trying to give them all time. And I would think that we're giving Taylor, Bryce, Keontae, Walker, 10th pick all time. The other 2 guys, so maybe that's only 5, but even that's a lot. I think those 5 of we're kind of dead set right now that 5 of our 8 or 9, call it 9-man rotation, are probably second year or less already. So I'm uninterested in another one.
PK was talking about the Danny Ainge specifically, but also Ryan Smith having a kind of the itch, right? They're competitive and they don't want to just sit around and lose. Who wants to do that? That's no fun, right? That's like Ainge sitting around on draft night saying, "Is this fun?" Nobody wants to have 0 picks on draft night. But at the same time, the temptation with the next draft supposed to be great, and you talk about how the best players in the top 5 and the next 5. So have a bad year and be in one of those spots in the draft and really tank in a season, not decide midway through the season, hey, we're going to move some guys and lose here over the last 30 games. Those 2 thoughts, there's kind of a tug-of-war going on as to which way this season might go. Do you have an idea which way this season might go?
That is my number one thought I have at all times. I agree with you. I mean, let's go. The NBA Finals is going to be one of 3 teams at this point, right? We're going to discount Indiana. We all good there?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so there will be either an NBA Final team that has 2 number 3 picks and a 4th pick in Kristaps Porzingis, and I think it was 4th pick, and they'll have against a team that has 2 number 1 picks, right? In Minnesota, or has the number 3 pick in Luka.
Who should have been number 1.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, one of the biggest draft disasters ever.
Right.
I mean, truly truly horrific, like Michael Jordan-esque horrific.
Right.
And at least Hakeem Olajuwon was the first pick of that draft.
Yeah.
So that like Houston can say that was okay. But DeAndre Ayton and Marvin Bagley instead of Luka Doncic, wow. Right. And then you got, so I think, all right, let me ask you a question. Vegas odds came out if the Vegas odds came out tomorrow, over under win total for next year, Jazz or Spurs, who has more?
Probably the Jazz, but asking that before everybody makes their off-season moves is pretty risky. Things can change fast if look, you always talk about what the Rockets did. You put a couple of nice veterans, not superstars, but good players, and you put them around the young talent, and you can boost your win total.
Okay.
So that's a little risky to predict. I would take Jazz. I don't know what the Blazers are doing. If Markkanen plays, the Jazz are better.
Okay. So, the question, I would have probably taken
Spurs
just because of Victor. And then I kind of think that the Jazz and the Blazers will both be sitting at the same number. But that'll be 14th in the Western Conference. So we are situated in a position where we could probably, without a lot of moves, get right into the Cooper Flag game. But it'll be it's a long year, and I think where you started this question, I don't have a feeling that Ryan or Danny or anyone has a desire to do that, but the world might be evolving in a manner that puts them in that position, whether they want to be there or not.
And there it is. We'll leave it right there. Denver or Minnesota, real quick. Who you got?
Well, I don't have Denver. I promise.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I'm still stuck in that series. Minnesota or Dallas?
He meant next year.
No, I'm stuck in the last series. It was going at best of 9. I'd watch it. Minnesota or Dallas, you got?
I have Dallas. I just think Luka's unguardable. I'd go back to all this conversation. There's some really interesting things going on in that series. Like everyone's criticizing the drop. I actually went back and rewatched that game after all the criticism by Stan, who I'm a huge fan of. I've gotten to know really well, and I'm a huge fan of Stan Van Gundy. But I actually thought the drop was the right coverage. Like Luka beat them on a bunch of 15-foot jump shots, didn't get to the rim. He's just amazing. If you don't do that, you're giving up 42 threes, and they're open, and an open three in the NBA is a 40% shot. They trapped a few times early, and every time they got an open look. Now, Mike Conley comes out afterwards and said we should have never been playing drop on any possession. Anytime we were playing drop, we made a mistake. Well, they played drop like 90% of their pick and roll coverages. So that's the weirdest comment I've heard after the game. I don't have any idea what happened there in Minnesota. So I'm super curious. And I go back to a conversation I had with Chris Finch a year ago. Actually, multiple conversations I had with Chris Finch a year ago about drop versus blitz versus hedging. He hates drop coverage. Like, he fundamentally doesn't like it. That was the whole rub with Rudy the first year, is that Rudy wanted to play drop all the time, and Chris Finch doesn't really believe in drop coverage. So for Minnesota to come out and drop that whole game against Luka, I thought was weird, but I thought was the right move. I was super impressed by it. Now Conley makes that comment. Back to my conversation with Finch, I'm totally mesmerized to see what they do tonight. No matter what happens, Luka's getting you wide open looks. He's just unguardable. He's simply, and there's no math that works to stop Luka. So, I don't know if Derek Jones, P.J. Washington, Tim Hardaway Jr., and Josh Green are actually good enough to knock down enough shots, particularly as the series goes on. And I guess if I'm Minnesota, I would rather have that. But boy, it's hard to win a series when you're based on, I'm going to give up wide open threes and hope people don't make them. That is not a great way to win a series.
David, we appreciate it. Good to have you back, and we will talk to you next week.
You guys are the best. I'm glad to know you just dismissed 33 years of friendship. That's interesting.
Thanks, David.
See ya.
When we come back, we look ahead to BYU football. Stay with us. Good morning, DJ and PK. It's 97.5 The Zone. PK, do you feel like a little college football right now?
Oh, always.
All right, let's do it. Let's look ahead to the 2024 season. Literally.
Yeah.
Did you bring this up because you want to make fun of me, or
No.
because you know it's in my wheelhouse and you know I like it?
Well, I think everybody likes it.
The schedule.
Honestly, was no intention of making fun of you.
How many of the Cougars going to win?
Yeah.
Well, they better start.
Who doesn't do that?
Do they have to start 3-0? Is there a chance SMU is really good and they could start 2-1?
Yeah.
And still make it to 6 wins? I mean, really, I feel like 6 is the low bar. I mean, they obviously got to get bowl eligible. But really, they need to finish with a winning record. And whether they get that 7th win, you don't want to say, they had another losing season. That just sounds bad. And I know it can be explained away based on what happens. You know, you're down to your 4th-string quarterback, and you eke out even one win with that guy. Great, right? So we'll adjust the bar as events dictate. But sitting here right now, just find a way to go 7-6. And if that's 7-5 with a bowl game loss or 6-6 with a bowl game win, I don't care. But be 7-6 so you don't say they had a losing record.
Yeah, unless their starter is Bohannon and he's a one-and-doner, you really can't build on that at that position.
Right.
And that bothers me a little bit.
But everybody else?
Everybody else has the opportunity to return. Whether they do or not remains to be seen. But at least you got something. I think they went 7-6 with Zach Wilson, right? Who'd they beat? Western Michigan over there in Boise.
And then they built off of that.
And so they were able to build on that. So I think that would be a little bit of a bummer. But obviously you take that over anything else that's worse than that. But if he ends up being the starter for 13 games, that would be a little bit of a downer.
We did our spring tour, and I just came away not knowing how good SMU is going to be. And obviously I don't know who BYU's quarterback is, so I got questions.
If they beat SMU on the road, that's a quality win.
They'd better beat Southern Illinois at home, and they had better win at Wyoming.
That'd be a quality loss if you lost to Southern Illinois.
I believe hideous loss is the phrase you're looking for.
Yes. So Wyoming on the road, that's going to be tough, man. I mean, the last Poinsettia Bowl was Wyoming and BYU, if you remember. Mm-hmm. And Mangum had to play. I think Hill was hurt. Mm-hmm. And I've been in that rivalry, right? And I was at that game covering it for the station, and it's just the Wyoming fans, they're just excited. And now you're not going to get in a football stadium. You're going to get it in the old, what do they call it, War Memorial over there?
Yep.
And that place is going to be packed because it's BYU. So, and none of these guys have any idea about that, although the coaches will.
You took the words right out of my mouth. They don't know what they're in for.
Yeah.
The energy they're going to get hit with. Now, I will say they get hit with a lot of energy, but because they were on the road in the Big 12, they have played in some hostile environments.
Yeah, but there's not going to be that hatred.
It's a different level of hostility. I get that. It comes from a different place.
It's like what I have for you.
Nonetheless, it's a hard place to play.
Yes. It's good you get them that time of year.
The weather in September versus the weather in November, night and day.
Right. I've been there in September. I've been there in November. It's drastically different. So that's going to be a decent win if you get it.
It better be a win.
If you want to dope it out across the board, I get it.
Then you get into league play. Open with Kansas State at home. Now, BYU only won 2 conference home games last year. The home schedule, going out of order, Kansas State, Arizona, Oklahoma State, Kansas, and Houston. You got to do better than 2 home wins. But having laid all those out there, Kansas and Kansas State, Oklahoma State, I mean, they got 3 quality teams coming in.
They do. Absolutely. No,
so
I agree. I believe they're top half of the conference.
Right. And the others are Arizona and Houston. Man, the thought that they could go 2-4 at home, beat Southern Illinois and Houston.
I mean, certainly you've got to get
4.
Houston, but you're going to have to get 1 or 2 of those games.
You are. I totally agree. I'm not debating that.
That's just the way it is.
I'm looking at it thinking which one of those is easy. Now, maybe when we get there, it'll be more obvious. Maybe the coaching transition takes its toll at Arizona. Maybe somebody's already down to a 3rd-string quarterback. Maybe somebody's lost half their O-line, blah, blah, blah. But, man, sitting here on paper right now, it looks like they didn't. The schedule makers didn't do them any favors.
Yeah, but this is big boy football here, man.
Okay, but we think we've identified the top 5 teams in the league, and they're playing them all.
Tough.
That's a bad break.
Sucks for you.
I mean, the top teams in the league aren't doing that.
Oklahoma, but at the same
State's
time,
only playing 2 of the top 4. They're one.
They had Oklahoma State in OT. They kind of blew it, and they had Oklahoma on the ropes.
Yep.
And they don't throw that dumb play and the pick 6 for 95 yards, whatever it was. So you had opportunities to win those ball games. So get the job done, man. What do you want? 6 cake wins? Go back to the WAC.
You're not in the Big 12 if you have 6 cake wins.
Right.
But I do think that when you're missing almost half the league, it's weird that you're playing the top 5 teams.
I don't care.
After they play Kansas State at home, which is a tough game, they go to Baylor. I got this circled as a must-win. If you're getting to 6, you got to be Baylor. You got to go down there and you got to win. Now, Baylor may throw us a curveball because they've been way down and way up and way down again. But right now, it doesn't look good for them. They're down. They lost recruits because they're down, and people are anticipating their coaches getting fired. I think the phrase is death spiral. That's a little dramatic, but I know. But nonetheless,
sounds like my personal life.
They're in a bad spot, and they're getting painted into a corner here, and you got to get them.
I agree.
No matter how I slice this schedule, if I'm looking at who are the best teams and who are the worst teams, Baylor's a W. Then they come home to play back-to-back games with Arizona and Oklahoma State. And Arizona Saturday, they get Oklahoma State on a Friday. Of the better teams, maybe that's one you should circle. Because as we watch more of these Friday night conference games, and we saw a few of them in the Pac-12, the road team looked like they were at a disadvantage. We saw some upsets. The overall number, I don't have it, but the overall number was skewed more heavily to the home team than just the rando numbers, cumulatively throughout a season. It's an advantage. They're going to play on a short week and spend time traveling.
When you look at it in its totality, that's basically half the schedule right there.
Yeah.
And that's 3 conference games at home by the time you get to the middle of October.
Those are games 6 and 7.
You cannot be 0-3 at home. So they got Kansas State on the 21st.
And then Arizona.
And we need to remember the 21st night of September at LaVell Edwards Stadium. I'm telling you that right now.
Sing it.
So they need to get that one and find a way to split.
Now,
or maybe they can go 1-2. Well, I'm assuming the Baylor win, right? Let's go. They win Baylor, but that's on the road. They've got to
win a home game and be 2-2 in league.
They can't be 0-3 at home and have any level of success.
Right. Then they go on the road, and this looks like another game. It's a road game, and it's a long trip, and you know me in the 2 time zones. But UCF, if you're going to have a good season, you probably ought to figure out how to win this game.
Agreed. But that's not going to be easy.
At Utah on consecutive weeks, it's so weird to have the rivalry game in early November. I'm used to the opener. I'm used to the 3rd game. I'm used to the 12th game. Utah, game 9.
I don't know why they did that.
TV. I think TV said we need a big game. That looks like a really good game to televise. And then you have to take less money. And nobody wants to take less money.
I don't think the television deal was contingent upon you playing Utah the last game of the season.
It was contingent on them getting to put dates, to have power over dates.
Every date?
I don't know that because I haven't read the contract.
Tell them no.
It is a bye week for BYU before that game. So they got that going for them. The bye week after 8 going into the Final Four because it's a double bye this year. So they have a bye the first week of October and the first week of November. And then down the stretch, at Utah, home to Kansas, at ASU, and home to Houston. They need to win those last 2 football games, ASU and Houston. Those are 2 more games I think they ought to be getting if they're getting to 6.
Well, I think Houston they should get. I think ASU is going to be a little bit better than people think, and I think they're going to get 1 or 2 wins that we don't see right now. Not saying that it's going to be BYU.
Well, we've gone through the schedule saying, worst case, they go 4-2 on the road. If they lose to Utah, and if they split, who's the best team they play on the road? And if they split with SMU, I guess they can lose one out of SMU, UCF, and ASU. And you lose one of those 3. But you better go 4-2 on the road. You got to win at Wyoming. You got to win at Baylor.
Okay.
Tough road.
Yeah.
Can they go 3-3 at home and 3-3 on the road and get to 6-6? Maybe that's the path.
Yeah, but I like your path better. The one you mentioned.
Yeah.
I like having those 4 wins on the road to give yourself some buffer.
The conference games they have at home are very difficult and look like the top of the league. The road games, with the exception of Utah, who should be the top of the league, the road games are against teams that at best should be the middle third of the league and maybe in the bottom half.
The thing that I will say with Utah, I believe in this rival, the possibility anything happened. Not always. Like in 04, they weren't going to win that game. That's not anything can happen. But I think this year we're able to...
getting back into anything can happen territory?
Yeah, and I think we'll continue to see it. I think we'll see more of a leveling out because I think BYU being in a conference brings the recruiting advantage smaller. I still think Utah has it because they've got the track record, and we'll see what happens when Kyle retires, how that changes. But for right now, people know about Utah more than they know about BYU as far as getting me to the pros. And I think that margin got really big, but I think it'll close over time.
So real quick here, we got like 2 minutes. If you rank these games confidence points, they do this thing, 1 through 12. The 12 points, the game you're most sure they're going to win, Southern Illinois at home in the opener.
Yeah, of course.
11, the next game. You want to go at Wyoming or do you want to go at Baylor or you got somebody else you think? Houston at home in the finale,
I
maybe?
would go Houston at home.
Then Wyoming?
Wyoming,
That's 12,
ASU.
12, 11, 10, 9. Okay.
And then, then it gets dicey.
Maybe at UCF.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a long trip and all. And
At SMU?
BYU people get distracted by Disneyland.
At SMU?
You'd have to.
Right.
Because it's the respect that I have of the other teams in the Big 12. I've seen enough of these teams and studied them on paper anyway to believe that they're good.
And they are getting some of these really good teams back-to-back. They've got to play in October. They've got Arizona and Oklahoma State back-to-back on Saturday the 12th and Friday the 18th. And then they've got a back-to-back November 9th and 16th with Utah and Kansas. And that's 4 games in 6 weeks with a bye mixed in there. And those 5 games, that could be a tough stretch.
What do you mean a back-to-back with Utah and Kansas?
They play Utah on November 9th and then turn around on November 16th and play Kansas.
But at home.
Right. Road and home, but in consecutive weeks, they have games that right now look really difficult to win. And so what that means is they actually have a stretch from mid-October to mid-November where they're going to play 5 games in 6 weeks, and they better win at UCF or it could get pretty ugly.
I think they got a shot to beat Kansas at home. Yeah. That's one that I give them a halfway decent shot. And if their QB is out for Kansas, I give them a much better shot. But who knows? As far as there's no way you could predict injury, and we know injury will occur.
Yep.
And BYU's been talking about depth. They didn't have it. They didn't have it in the independent era. It's gotten better, and so they're going to have to find a way to withstand all those injuries that they've had.
Well, start fast. You're presumably healthy at the start of the year. Southern Illinois at home, at SMU, at Wyoming, home to Kansas State, and at Baylor. 4-1. You got to be 4-1 after the first 5 games.
Oh, if they're 4-1, they're going bowling.
Because you got ASU and Houston at the end of the schedule, and you'll pick someone else off along the way.
Unless you get decimated, yeah, you'll have momentum.
Because last year they were 5-2, and then they lost 5 in a row. They had a quarterback injury. They did. And the 2 games last year we were saying you better have bowl eligibility in the bag by game 10. Because games 11 and 12 with Oklahoma State and Oklahoma back-to-back, that looked brutal. And the truth is, even though BYU lost those games, they looked better in those 2 games than they'd basically looked in a month leading up to them.
That was a surprise.
Right. Those games were great. The trip to West Virginia, that was a debacle.
They found a little bit of momentum in losses.
Yeah.
And I think that if they have a quarterback injury this year, they'll be far better able to withstand it to get some level of success than they did last year.
Last year they had to turn to a JC guy who'd never played D1 football.
Right.
And this year,
no matter who it is, they've got 2 other guys.
Yeah, they've got 3 guys who have played D1 football. And when they run onto the field, they know what they're getting into.
Finnegan, too, but I don't think he's going to be in the mix. He played a little bit at Boise after he got off his mission.
So they could have 4 guys with experience if necessary.
Yeah.
But you never, ever.
But if you're playing your 14
guy,
quarterback, you're in your world of hurt.
Right. All right, DJ and PK, it's 97.5 The Zone. Coming up next, what is trending? The headlines are on the way.